Now this person grows up not really knowing how to be in a genuine relationship, and they get into relationships as an adult, and they don't understand why they keep fizzling out and why the woman keeps saying things like, you are not emotionally available. And they're like, but I buy you gifts or I take you on trips. And then they begin to realize through the work, as we go through this, that that is not connecting. And in fact, they didn't feel that they were connected at all to their parent because they were never recognized. They were just given gifts. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, I share a clip from my interview on Lindsey Miller's podcast, The Stress Nanny, where we explore how mindfulness and psychodynamic therapy, though different in language and method, can deeply inform one another. Listening back on the clip that I'm about to share with you, I found myself reflecting on how these two frameworks actually speak to each other in a powerful way. I wanted to just take a moment and share with you those reflections. When recovering from a narcissistic relationship, both approaches offer meaningful but distinct lenses. In my discussion with Lindsey, we looked at how these relationships often represent unconscious attempts to meet unresolved childhood needs. From a psychodynamic perspective, it's not just poor judgment that draws someone into or to a narcissistic partner. It's often what we call a repetition compulsion, a fantasy that this time the abandoning or rejecting figure will finally offer love, stability, or recognition. In that sense, the current narcissistic relationship becomes a stage for reenacting earlier relational trauma. In other words, earlier relational deprivation. Mindfulness offers a distinct but actually complementary angle. Lindsey emphasizes the power of the present moment awareness and the non-judgmental observation of one's internal world. Interestingly, psychodynamic therapy also values present moment awareness and non-judgmental attunement. In fact, this is the foundation to the initial act of containment, which also includes validation. Something for any of you who have listened to prior episodes, you've heard me speak of this or speak to this quite extensively. The goal is staying close to the patient's subjective experience without rushing to interpret or correct their experience of something. Again, that's containment, and part of containment initially is validation. But I want to point out that psychodynamic therapy goes a step further than this. It seeks not only to hold the experience, but to understand and interpret the deeper meanings behind the emotional responses. In other words, how past relationships, unconscious fantasies, and internalized conflicts are shaping what's happening today. It was in this rich overlap between the psychodynamic perspective, emotional insight, and mindful presence that our conversation unfolded. So with all that in mind, here's a clip from my conversation with Lindsey Miller.
As we get started, let's just go over some basics. When somebody's been through a narcissistic relationship, what are some of the emotional or psychological challenges they're left with?
Okay, so if it's okay, I want to set a foundation of like what is a narcissistic relationship, but just for your listeners, I want to share my bias, which is this is from a psychodynamic perspective, okay? So from a psychodynamic perspective, a narcissistic relationship primarily exists in what we call an illusion. That's the illusion of togetherness. That's what we call a blissful union, or some people call it codependency. Some other people call it a shared unconscious fantasy. But primarily, if it's really a narcissistic relationship, it's about two people coming together to finally feel like they've been seen, that they've been validated, that they're recognized, that they're being held, all the things that typically go missing earlier in life, things that they missed out on that they're looking to fix in their current relationship. So that's sort of the foundation. But let me just pause just for a moment to see, does that even make sense? Or is there anything more that I could say about just what is this kind of relationship?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that explanation and the way you tethered it to some other things. Let's maybe dive a little deeper just for our listeners, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail. But how you initially kind of recognize or come to the realization that, like, maybe you're using a present relationship to meet past needs.
Okay, so one thing that you'll typically see in these relationships, which is like a red flag, is an intense level of togetherness. In other words, each partner has a hard time letting the other partner exist in their own right. So I don't mean just literal separations, which, by the way, are always painfully difficult. He wants to go out with his friends. She wants to go on a trip with the girls. There's usually a fight around that because togetherness, and not just togetherness, but everything has to be great. Everybody has to always be happy. Why do we have to talk about negative things? Can't you just be more positive? These are all things that one imagines should occur in a relationship, but this is not what makes up a healthy relationship. Togetherness and time alone, one opinion is okay. If the other opinion is different, these are all signs of a very healthy relationship. So those are the red flags. And I mean, there are many more, but the glaring red flag is problems around separation and letting the other person exist in their own right as a separate person with their own opinion. That's different than yours. That's the key. If they can't have their own opinion, if it's the same as yours, because then that's the blissful togetherness again.
Okay. Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you. That was clarifying. Now let's go like one step further. In that relationship, there is this like blissful togetherness. Everything seems great, but then engaging outside of that relationship with other people, there's some friction, right?
Yeah, because once you're doing something outside the relationship, again, if there are narcissistic disturbances, it's not just like a separation, but it's often experienced as an abandonment. Like you left me or you rejected me. And for the narcissist or someone who has these characteristics, that's too painfully difficult to tolerate. And that's why there's often a fight around somebody doing something that's different or having a hobby that's separate from. So having a life outside is difficult for another reason as well, which is if you go out and you have fun, what does that mean? What does that say about me? Am I no longer valuable? In other words, I thought I was the most important person. It's like someone who, let's say, has a family and there are a couple of kids and they need to go away on a business meeting and they start getting anxious about leaving for their business meeting. And I explore that with them because part of what I do in my work with these individuals is I get really close as possible to their subjective experience. And I start to explore this. And what I discover is, what if I go away and everybody's fine, the family's fine, and they function without me and they have a good time? See, that means I'm not really that important. I'm kind of irrelevant in the family. And for the person who has these narcissistic traits, they need to feel like the most important thing. I get a lot of messages from listeners saying, Dr. Mazzella, I wish I could talk to you directly. But I also know that private therapy or one-on-one sessions aren't always possible or affordable. That's why I'm thinking about creating office hours, a low-cost, small group space where you can bring your questions about the podcast content, your confusion about narcissistic relationships, traits, and dynamics, and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's room for real conversation too. This space is designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If this speaks to you, head to drmazzella.com/office hours, or just click on the link in the show notes to get notified when it launches. Okay, hope to see you there.
That's powerful. The pull of that on the person in the relationship is so strong that there are limited opportunities, right? To, like you're saying, to have any external experience to kind of alert them to the fact that, like, oh, maybe this isn't how most people do it, or, oh, maybe this is different, or, oh, like, because it's so insular, there
Yes.
are less reference points outside, right?
Yeah.
To kind of verify
Actually,
what's going
Lindsay,
on.
that's a really good point. I didn't even mention that, is that in general, I work not just with individuals, but with couples as well. And oftentimes by the time they get to me, their life is very insular. In other words, there's not many rich opportunities that go on outside of either themselves or the family, or maybe a very close circle. But that usually just includes their families. Like, oh, we're always at his family's house, or we're always with her mother. So yeah, life becomes very limited in that way, which then just feeds into, unfortunately, and becomes a perpetuating cycle of disillusionment.
Yeah. Yeah. So then let's say, like, post relationship, let's say someone is recognized, they've tried to reconcile, trying to work through it, maybe haven't been able to, have put some distance in that relationship, right? And they're now post relationship trying to kind of figure out how to engage with people from a more healthy or a more autonomous place. What are some of the, like, leftover remnants of the relationship they're going to have to kind of manage and deal with? What are those emotional and psychological challenges that are
Well,
maybe going to be with them for a
yeah.
bit?
Oh boy, this one is a little complicated. Can I use an analogy just sort of to
Yeah.
drive it home to the listeners? So if anybody has known anybody who's been caught up in a scam, right? So these people that get caught up in a scam oftentimes give away their whole life savings, right? And I've heard these stories before, and they have loved ones telling them, you are being scammed, right? But they can't hear it because there's this illusion of what? Fame, power, wealth. There's a big payoff at the end. So for someone to leave a scam, for someone to leave a cult, right, where you're also brainwashed into believing that salvation is just around the corner, right, that all your needs are going to be gratified, for someone to leave a narcissistic relationship, you see, it's the same thing. So to your point, Lindsay, when you leave, now if you leave that illusion behind, which is not easy because you're leaving the hope, the promise of salvation, and all what we call internal propaganda that goes along with it. That life is going to be wonderful once this happens, right? So now you're in reality and you're expected to leave that behind. And that's a big, big loss, right? Because, you just gave away your whole life savings, or you've been with this partner for many years. So that's on one level what makes it very difficult, because you're asking someone to step into a painful reality and leave all the internal propaganda behind. That's one thing. And I'll just mention one other thing that's really hard. The question is, why would you ever leave this relationship if it seems so wonderful and blissful and there's this togetherness and you have, yeah, maybe you don't have a lot of friends or hobbies, but you do have your family of origin, and or maybe his, but it also comes with intense levels of intense moments of devaluation as well. Because when there are times when there is separation, and it's inevitable, it's so hard to stay in a narcissistic bubble, just reality always gets in the way, then you are devalued, or you're devaluing him. And then there's, a lot of intense fighting, name calling. And when you leave, you're not just giving up something, which is that propaganda that I mentioned, the salvation, but you also take something with you. And I think you know about this, Lindsay. In fact, we spoke about this
Yeah.
earlier. right, is you take the negative voices with you. Like, remember the stream of negativity
Yeah.
coming at you? So all the voices of like, you can't make it without me. I'm the only one who will ever put up with you. You don't feel worthy or capable. Could you imagine then trying to start a life with not just the loss that you're asked to deal with, but now what you also bring with you, which are these critical voices? So those are just a few of the most immediate challenges when someone gets out of this kind of relationship.
Thank you for the way you described it. And as you were talking, I was thinking and tethering some of the things you had said. And as Anthony mentioned, we had a conversation about mindfully approaching these
Yes.
types of relationships on his podcast. And we'll talk more about that at the end. And I'm going to link to it in the show notes. But one of the things that was just like a stark reality with what you were describing is like with this vision of perfection, this vision of the amazingness of this relationship eventually. And then you had said, I think if I heard you right, a lot of times the blame for that vision not coming to fruition
Yes.
is the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So if the other person is to blame for the demise of the relationship, and then they're also devalued because of all the things said in the relationship, and then they're trying to like bravely step foot into a space where they're all of a sudden confident and competent about making their own choices. I mean, that's such a big leap.
Yes. Especially because I'll just add one other piece, which I know is always a little controversial, but for people who have a little bit of a more open mind to this, and this is complicated stuff, so I'm not saying this definitively, but oftentimes it's called a shared unconscious fantasy because both people in the relationship are looking to have some sort of need met. And that means that they can't do it internally. So they need those external supplies. They need that constant source of external validation. When her husband just goes in the other room with the kids, the feeling is, why would he leave me alone here? Why didn't he invite me into the room with the kids? He's playing with them without me. So there's that constant need. And I say it's controversial because it's a lot more comfortable and easier. And I hear this quite a bit to say, look at my narcissistically disturbed partner, whatever, husband, wife, mother, whoever it is. And that may be true. I want to emphasize that. It doesn't mean that they're not, but oftentimes there's an interpersonal dynamic that keeps these relationships alive. So now back to your point, Lindsey. So when they leave the relationship, if in fact that is true, what I'm saying, that they do depend on external validation and supplies as well, how can they possibly be in another relationship in a healthy way unless they begin to work this through? Because then once they get in another relationship, they're going to lean on their friend or family member or next partner for the same type of relationship, because that's what went missing again in their earlier childhood. And just as a quick aside, I can't tell you how often I hear this. I hear it on social media. And recently I did an interview with a woman and we were talking about this, and she was very honest in sharing that when she left her narcissistic husband, she said, my next three relationships were all with people who were pathologically disturbed. Other people say I end up going back to the relationship, even though it's not what I want. I'm pulled back into it. So I'm sorry to make it a little more complicated, but that's another challenge that they face, is that that need for something doesn't just go away because they they left the relationship. They have to really start to work through it. Hmm.
Yes. Yeah. No, I'm so glad you pointed that out. One of my dear friends is navigating life post narcissistic divorce, and
Yeah.
she has been doing so much work around just these very things you're saying, right? Around
Hmm.
trying to figure out what dynamics, what patterns, what needs she needs to meet for herself in
Yes.
order to connect in a relationship in a more whole way, you
Yes.
know? And on your show, we spent quite a bit of time talking about like sitting in the discomfort of those
Yes.
types of moments, right? Like those realizations, those are not easy to stomach.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll tell you just something again as an aside, the realization, it's such a strange thing because it's so gratifying to watch, like when I work with these patients go through it, even though it's so painfully difficult, it's both heartbreaking but so necessary. So someone like who grows up, like this is like a prototypical example with, let's say, a narcissistically disturbed or a preoccupied parent who doesn't have the capacity to really be there for them emotionally when they're a child, but gives them a lot of gifts, right? So the way they express love is through gift giving. So now this person grows up not really knowing how to be in a genuine relationship, and they get into relationships as an adult, and they don't understand why they keep fizzling out and why the woman keeps saying things like, you are not emotionally available. And they're like, but I buy you gifts or I take you on trips. And then they begin to realize through the work, as we go through this, that is not connecting. And in fact, they didn't feel that they were connected at all to their parent because they were never recognized. They were just giving gifts. So this is one of the ways that then it interferes with the next relationship. I'm still thinking about what it's like, post.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I thank you for bringing that up. That's so insightful too, because I think the place where mindfulness can have an impact here is in the moment to moment decisions, right? And we've talked about that the type of work that you do is at the heart of making those changes, right? Of recognizing the patterns, recognizing the needs, understanding how to move forward in a way that helps you meet those needs more autonomously.
Yeah.
And then mindfulness is what is a little toolkit you can use in those small today moments when you have this pull towards something isn't going to support you, and
Yes.
this tiny spark of bravery pulling you forward into the person that you're trying to become, right?
Yes. Yep.
And having the support and the awareness on that journey is so vital.
As you just heard, we also touched on what happens after a narcissistic relationship ends. Psychodynamically, I suggested this is where remnants of the quote-unquote shared unconscious fantasy continue to linger, where the person continues to seek a partner who will regulate their self-esteem, unconsciously hoping someone new will finally give them what was never received. The individual may feel autonomous on the surface, but sometimes they may be driven by unrecognized dependency longings. Mindfulness, in contrast, encourages observing these urges without acting on them, helping one develop a witnessing stance. Lindsey went into this in more detail when I interviewed her. If you want to learn more about that, check out last week's episode. Ultimately, both approaches are asking the same question in different ways. How can I be with myself, with my pain, with my longings, my shame and guilt, without losing my center or reenacting the past in a new relationship or returning to the old relationship? Anyway, if you find this clip interesting and you want to hear more, stay tuned. I'll be releasing another segment real soon. But if you'd like to hear the entire interview now, you can head over to Lindsey's podcast. I'll include the link in the show notes below. Okay, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.